He was a normal security guard who was enticed by his best friend to do the unthinkable.
Doing it with or without you.
Oh, really? You gonna do it without me?
Yeah, really. And when I get there, you can call the cops.
They committed a felony, not knowing this will get the most feared mafia right after them.
Get us off fucking money!
But the mafia was not all alone, as the best detective in US history was also hunting them.
I won't hesitate to drag your ass in if I find out you've been lying to me about all this shit.
Welcome back to Paramount Recaps. I don't have many subscribers, but your single comment is a ray of hope to motivate me. The movie opens with an intense scene involving the largest cash robbery. A staggering $8 million is stolen. The FBI and local detectives are baffled by the heist, which involved robbers cutting a hole in the roof and manipulating the security cameras inside to make the crime appear like an inside job. We then flash back 3 months earlier to Queens, where Eddie, the protagonist, quits his job. A confrontation ensues when one of his bosses gets physical with him, but Eddie's friend intervenes, knocking the boss out. Eddie and his friend escape in their car. As they drive, we meet Chris, Eddie's old friend. They pull over, and Chris retrieves a statue from the back of the car, which he plans to give to his mother as a gift. After a warm exchange with Chris's mother, Eddie and Chris leave to continue their day. The scene shifts to Chris visiting a local hangout, where he inquires Spiro about the whereabouts of his father. The scene transitions to a tense confrontation in the bathroom between Chris, his father Tommy, and Spiro. The altercation escalates until an outsider intervenes to break up the fight. The following morning, as Chris and his father have breakfast, Chris receives a rejection letter from the NYPD due to unresolved issues from a past criminal offense. Disheartened, Chris meets with Eddie and 2 others, acknowledging that his aspiration to become a police officer is slipping away. He shares with Eddie that a previous mistake, known as the doobie, has derailed his law enforcement career. Later, Chris visits a diner where he runs into his friend Nancy. She offers her support, and during their conversation, Chris notices an ad for a security guard position in the newspaper. He heads to the location and quickly accepts a job offer for $200 a week after speaking with the boss. The next day, Chris starts his new job working with Tony inside an armored truck. Tony explains their daily routine, including making 8 to 10 pickups and returning to the reserve by Wednesday morning. During their first pickup, Tony instructs Chris to watch the truck while he handles the transaction. Tony returns with the cash, and Chris takes his position in the back of the truck as Tony drives away. Tony, looking forward to finishing early for his daughter's birthday, retrieves the keys to their lockup. Chris notices that the facility appears unprofessional and disorganized. Chris's demeanor changes drastically when he discovers $25 million in cash stored in the lockup, where a dog and a camera are the only forms of security. Tony, looking to get to his daughter's birthday party, leaves Chris to handle the remaining pickups alone. Upon returning home, Chris finds his father, Tommy, sitting dejectedly at the table. Chris's mother reveals that Tommy was fired after 10 years on the job, and the bathroom incident earlier was the cause. The next day, Chris voices his frustration to Tony, expressing concerns about his father's situation and suspecting criminal activity. While they are talking, a van approaches, and a bag is thrown under their truck. Suddenly, gunshots erupt. Tony is shot multiple times and continues to fight back, but the robbers empty an entire clip into him. The robbers flee when they hear sirens approaching. Detective James arrives at the scene and questions Chris. Chris, angered and distressed, swears at James and expresses his respect for Tony before walking away. That night, Nancy visits Chris and his family to check on him. After she leaves, Chris's sister joins the table, and Eddie arrives at the house, making himself at home. Chris, still upset, avoids him. Weeks later, Chris returns to work with a new partner. As he handles his duties, he notices bullet holes in his old work clothes. Chris is summoned by his boss, who assigns him to the night shift. Although unhappy with the change, Chris accepts the shift and continues on. At night, Chris is left alone to guard the lockup, while the other workers move the money from the truck into the facility. As he monitors the cameras, boredom sets in, prompting Chris to explore the area. The next day, Chris informs Eddie that the lockup staff and owners are involved in document forgery and theft. While walking past Spiro and his men, Eddie expresses his frustration over Tommy's firing, but nothing changes. Eddie then persuades Chris to steal money that night. That night, Chris enacts his plan. He unlocks the gate to the lockup and opens the door slightly by entering the security code. When his boss calls about a supposed flickering light, Chris reassures him while secretly using a metal rod to pull out a bag of cash. He manages to take $25,000 from the facility, splitting it between Eddie and Tony's family as compensation for the earlier incident. Eddie reveals Chris's theft to Spiro's associates, Jimmy the Greek and Mike Demetrio. They question Chris about being the only night worker. Chris deflects the suspicion onto Eddie and reveals that both men work for Spiro. Eddie continues to push for a larger heist, convincing Chris that stealing $1 million will secure their future. At home, Chris contemplates his next steps, while Tommy sleeps on the couch. Distracted by thoughts of money, Chris contacts Eddie, agreeing to participate in the heist. Mike and Jimmy debate whether to inform Spiro, but ultimately decide not to. Under pressure, Jimmy drops out of the plan, and Mike assures Chris that Jimmy will remain silent under threat of death. The plan is set for Thursday night. With Chris as the sole guard, Eddie will jump the fence and disable a camera. On Friday night, the guards are supposed to leave by 8 p.m., and Chris will call them from a payphone once they've left. As the night unfolds, Detective James receives word of a possible crew targeting the facility. He secures the area and positions his men to monitor the situation. Chris, feeling the pressure, tries to keep the plan on track. When James is informed about a situation outside, he opens the door and a shootout ensues. Chris makes his way outside with his gun. James and his team engage the intruders. With the cop on the roof taking down one suspect, James locates another suspect hiding behind a truck and shoots him multiple times. However, it turns out the suspect was not Mike. As the person tries to get up, Chris intervenes and kills him. Mike, suspecting that someone has leaked information about their heist, eliminates Jimmy on the street to keep things under control. Eddie informs Chris of Jimmy's death and Mike's insistence on proceeding, but Chris, feeling betrayed and desperate, wants to back out. Eddie, however, insists that the heist is still on and will happen with or without Chris's participation. That night, as the guards clock out at 8 p.m., Chris is left alone to monitor the security cameras. Unexpectedly, Eddie drops in from the roof, determined to take the money. When Chris answers a call from his boss about a disturbance, he lies, claiming everything is under control. Eddie demands access to the lockup, and Chris reluctantly opens the gate. However, when a guard dog approaches, Eddie shoots it. Eddie, in a state of panic, then attacks Chris and knocks him unconscious. Chris regains consciousness to find the area swarming with police. Detective James, the first to approach, questions him intensely. Despite the pressure, Chris maintains that he's too disoriented to provide useful information, and the detectives eventually leave him. Returning home, Chris is confronted by reporters about the missing $9 million. He dismisses their inquiries and heads inside to call Eddie, who doesn't answer. Chris decides to search for Eddie. Meanwhile, the FBI, meeting with District Attorney Rudolph, reveals that approximately $10 million was stolen. One agent suggests the previous robbery may have been a diversion, but they believe Chris is too inexperienced to be involved. They shift their focus to the organized crime families, leading to arrests and questioning of major crime figures. Chris later meets with Eddie, and tensions rise. Mike requests a meeting with both of them, but Chris refuses and warns Eddie that he will kill him if they cross paths again. With $8 million in his possession, Chris resolves to keep the money and avoid further complications. Detective James, trying to piece together the unfolding events, observes Eddie heading towards Mike's car, realizing that Mike carried out the robbery on his own without informing Eddie. Mike is furious and demands that Eddie cover an $8 million Colombian deal, with the condition that Chris is not involved. James witnesses this interaction and returns to the station to dig into Mike's background. That night, Mike meets with Spiro, who inquires about Jimmy's whereabouts. Mike fabricates an excuse and heads to the bathroom. James and his partner then arrive at Spiro's location and question him about the heist. Spiro mocks their inquiry and dismisses it. James zeroes in on Mike, suspecting his involvement, but Spiro reassures James that his men wouldn't act against his wishes, implying severe consequences. James leaves, and Mike is left behind to sit with Spiro. James reviews surveillance footage at the station, focusing on Eddie's interactions. Chris arrives at the station, and James pulls him into his office. James thanks Chris for saving his life the previous night and begins questioning him. He shows Chris photos of Mike and Eddie, asking if Chris knows them. Chris acknowledges knowing them, but claims he hasn't been in touch recently. James then presents footage of Eddie speaking to someone before tampering with a camera. Chris insists he saw no one else and prepares to leave. James warns him that if he's involved in the heist, he'll be taken to jail. Later that night, Mike and Eddie arrive at a Colombian house. Eddie is visibly nervous as Mike opens a bag containing $8 million. The Colombian representatives ask about Jimmy, and Mike informs them that Jimmy is out of the game. The Colombians begin counting the money. Meanwhile, Chris, having been summoned, meets with Spiro and his men. Spiro questions Chris directly, demanding information about the stolen money from the heist. Out of nowhere, Jimmy emerges from the bathroom. Having survived the shooting, Spiro demands the money from Chris immediately. Meanwhile, James and his partner decide to visit Nancy, requesting permission to search Eddie's locker. The manager agrees, and they find a document outlining the robbery plans. Back at the Colombian house, the Colombians confirm the cash is correct, but notice an extra $400. They refuse to provide the supply and demand Mike and Eddie leave. Mike resists and is shot in the mouth. In the ensuing chaos, Eddie flees while Mike is killed. Chris is abandoned on the roadside. Eddie tries to call him from a payphone, but is intercepted by Jane, who informs Eddie that the situation is over. At the station, James reveals that crime families are in custody and questions how a mid-level Colombian Colombian dealer ended up with half the stolen money. He demands to know where Chris and the remaining money are. At home, Chris finds more officers searching for him. He instructs Nancy to check the statue for the money. Eddie warns Chris that the police are aware of everything, and Chris tells Eddie that Jimmy is still alive with the remaining $16 million. Eddie, desperate, pulls out a gun demanding more cash. Suddenly, Tommy appears and shoots Eddie, taking control of the situation. He holds Eddie at gunpoint as the police close in. When the officers arrive, James and the team order Tommy to drop the weapon. All three men, Tommy, Eddie, and Chris, are arrested. Chris is left to witness his father's arrest. In a public announcement, the FBI declares Chris Potomaitis as the mastermind behind the heist. Despite the bewilderment over how the burglars got through the roof, the rest of the stolen money remains unaccounted for. The real Chris Potomaitis claims that the money simply disappeared. Chris and Eddie were released in 1991. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel out. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below with your suggestions for future videos, any questions you have, or just to say hi. Your feedback is super important to us and helps us create better content for you. Also, feel free to share this video with your friends, family, and on social media. It really makes a big difference and helps our community grow. You can follow us on Insert your social media handles for more updates and behind-the-scenes content. Thanks again for your support, and we'll see you in the next video.